Imagine a punishment so terrifying that even saying its name could make a hardened warrior tremble. Flaying alive. The very idea sounds like something out of a horror movie. But this was once a reality used by kings, conquerors, and tyrants to make sure no one ever forgot who was in charge. It wasn't just about killing a person. Oh no, that would be too merciful. This was about turning human skin into a political billboard, and unfortunately for history, there was no shortage of rulers who thought this was the perfect way to send a message. Now, before anyone clutches their arms in sympathy, let's get one thing clear. This wasn't just a medieval accident or one civilization's cruel invention. Flaying people alive has popped up in different corners of the world across centuries, as if human creativity just couldn't resist asking, hey, what if we peel a person like an orange, but slowly? That's the hook of this story. Humans repeatedly decided this was the way to go when they wanted fear to echo louder than any speech. Take the ancient Assyrians, for example. These folks were not exactly famous for their compassion. They built one of the fiercest empires the world had ever seen, and their kings had a flair for psychological warfare. Assyrian kings didn't just want to conquer, they wanted the survivors to never even think about rebellion again. And so flaying was their red carpet method. Picture this: an Assyrian ruler standing tall, a rebel leader tied up nearby, and soldiers slowly removing his skin in front of everyone. When it was done, the skin wasn't tossed aside. No, it was nailed to city walls like a grotesque poster, a reminder that crossing the empire meant losing not just your life but also your outer packaging. Talk about a chilling form of billboard advertising. And here's the wild part. The Assyrians didn't keep this secret. They actually carved stone reliefs showing flayed victims. Yes, instead of hiding the horror, they decorated their palaces with it, as if saying, "Welcome to the royal court. Please admire our collection of screaming, skinless enemies." Imagine if modern politicians put that on their campaign posters. Suddenly attack ads don't sound so bad, right? But the Assyrians weren't the only ones perfecting this dreadful art. Jump forward to the Persians. Herodotus, the famous Greek historian, wrote about a judge named Sisamnes who accepted a bribe. Bad move. King Cambyses II, who apparently had a very creative streak, decided the punishment should be, you guessed it, flaying alive. Sisamnes' skin was stripped and then used to upholster the judge's chair. That way, every time his replacement sat down to work, he'd literally be sitting on a reminder not to mess with justice. Imagine working at your desk, knowing the office chair is basically your predecessor's leather jacket, except, well, not the store-bought kind. Now here's where things get stranger. For all its grotesque cruelty, flaying wasn't just about the person being punished. It was theater, symbolism, a kind of ritual humiliation that went beyond the body. It told everyone watching that the ruler wasn't just in control of your life and death, he owned your very skin, your identity, your legacy. And rulers around the world seemed to agree this was a pretty effective PR strategy. Let's head to Europe for a moment, where medieval justice wasn't exactly known for its gentle touch. In the Middle Ages, flaying made appearances in ways that would make even the grimmest executioner wince. There's a record from England in the 14th century of a man named Walter, the mayor of London, who was accused of corruption. Now, in most cases, a corrupt politician might get fined, maybe locked up, but Walter, nope, he was flayed. And just like that, unlucky Persian judge, his skin was used as a warning, this time stretched over the city gates. Imagine tourists walking by centuries later. Oh look, Big Ben, the Tower of London. And wait, what's that stretched thing over there? But here's the kicker. Flaying didn't always mean death, at least not right away. Sometimes it was used to prolong suffering, peeling just enough to make sure the victim stayed alive for the audience's benefit. Think of it like the world's most horrifying live performance. This wasn't about execution efficiency. It was about dragging the process out so everyone could savor the spectacle. And rulers weren't shy about gathering crowds. Public executions were already popular entertainment. Flaying was the VIP front row nightmare edition. The more you look into history, the more you realize how disturbingly common this was. In ancient Mexico, for example, some Aztec rituals involved flaying sacrificial victims and then having priests wear the skins during ceremonies. To the Aztecs, this was symbolic, representing rebirth, the shedding of old life into new. But still, imagine showing up to a religious festival and seeing someone casually walking around in somebody else. Not exactly the kind of costume party most people would sign up for. And then there's the question, how did executioners even do this? The technical details are gruesome, but they matter because they show just how much effort went into this punishment. You didn't just grab a knife and hack away. Skilled executioners, yes, apparently skilled is the word here, knew how to slice carefully, starting at the legs or back, pulling sections of skin while keeping the victim alive as long as possible. It was part torture, part medical horror experiment. Some accounts even describe the skin being removed whole, like a suit. And if that image doesn't make someone grateful for modern-day problems like traffic jams and Wi-Fi outages, nothing will. But the real horror is how normalized this became in certain places. It wasn't a one-off shock tactic. It was written into law, carried out on rebels, criminals, even unlucky generals who failed in battle. And while it's easy to sit in the present and say, wow, those people were monsters, the uncomfortable truth is that flaying served a purpose. It wasn't just cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was propaganda, deterrence, and psychological warfare. Because what better way to make sure no one forgets a lesson than by literally peeling it into the walls of a city? And yet, this is only scratching the surface. Because if the Assyrians and Persians turned flaying into political theater, later empires found new, bizarre ways to twist it into their justice systems. Just when you think history couldn't possibly get any darker, someone comes along and says, "Hold my knife." The Assyrians and Persians might have set the stage, but Europe took the performance and made it something the average townsperson could watch without traveling to a king's palace. Justice in medieval Europe was designed to be loud, visible, and unforgettable. Executions were scheduled almost like social events. Children would be brought along, vendors sold snacks, and people actually cheered. And when flaying was on the menu, it turned into something people would whisper about for decades afterward. One case that stuck like a scar in England was the fate of a man named Hugh Despenser the Younger in the 14th century. He wasn't just unpopular, he was reviled, accused of corruption, treachery, and every crime you could imagine. When he was finally captured, the punishment needed to send a message. Some accounts describe him being hanged, drawn and quartered, but there are also whispers that his skin was peeled away in parts as a public spectacle. Whether every detail is true or not, the fact that chroniclers even suggested flaying as part of the tale says everything about how natural it seemed to include it in a punishment for someone so hated. And then you get the more bureaucratic side of flaying, where it wasn't about one person's downfall, but about stamping government authority into the very stones of a city. Remember Walter, the corrupt London official whose skin was nailed to the gates? That wasn't unique. Other European towns occasionally displayed bits of flayed skin as if they were traffic signs. Corruption not allowed beyond this point. They didn't have Photoshop, so human leather apparently had to do the job. But Europe wasn't the only place carrying this torch. Over in Asia, there were dynasties that considered flaying a fitting penalty for betrayal. In China, during the Ming Dynasty, the punishment called lingqi, better known as death by 1,000 cuts, sometimes included partial flaying before slicing the body into pieces. The goal wasn't just death, but humiliation, erasing dignity one piece at a time. Records tell of criminals whose skins were displayed as a warning. And this wasn't some back-alley practice. It was imperial justice, carried out under official authority, with crowds encouraged to attend. There's also the story of Zheng He's era, when officials accused of corruption or rebellion faced the possibility of their skins ending up as gruesome trophies. Picture being summoned by the emperor, knowing your career could end not just with disgrace, but with your hide stretched out in the sun. And if the Assyrian walls could talk, so too could the city gates of Beijing, because flayed skins nailed to wood don't exactly fade quietly into history. Then there's India, where invaders and emperors sometimes turned to flaying as well. The Mughal period in particular was not shy about punishments that blurred the line between justice and theater. Rebellion against the empire was often treated as an insult that needed not just to be crushed, but paraded. And what better parade float than a human reminder of pain? Some rebels weren't just executed, they were flayed and their remains displayed in public squares, ensuring that anyone tempted to resist would think twice. What's chilling is how often rulers reused the same idea, century after century, as if no one thought, maybe there's a less horrifying way to handle this. Instead, history shows a pattern. Once a ruler discovered flaying worked as a deterrent. Others were eager to copy it. Cruelty was contagious. But it wasn't only kings, emperors, or judges who reached for this punishment. Sometimes ordinary people get involved. During uprisings, mobs occasionally captured hated tax collectors or soldiers and decided to give them the royal treatment. In these moments, flaying wasn't about formal justice. It was raw revenge, fueled by fury. There are accounts of peasant revolts where the victims were skinned alive not by decree, but by popular demand. The crowd wanted blood, and they wanted it slow. It's also worth noting that flaying had symbolic weight in myths and stories, which kept its terror alive, even when it wasn't happening right in front of people. Take the Greek myth of Marsyas, a satyr who challenged Apollo to a music contest. When he lost, Apollo's punishment was not a polite "better luck next time." No, Apollo flayed him alive for daring to compete with a god. The myth doesn't just show cruelty, it's a warning about overstepping boundaries. The message is crystal clear: challenge the wrong person, and you don't just lose, you lose your skin. That blending of myth and history gave flaying a kind of cultural immortality. People didn't need to see it to believe in its power. The very idea was enough to shape behavior, and rulers leaned into that fear. Sometimes the threat of flaying was more powerful than the act itself. If the king promised to skin anyone who betrayed him, most people didn't wait around to find out if he was bluffing. And still, the spectacle never lost its audience. In the Ottoman Empire, reports tell of rebels and traitors being flayed, and their skins stuffed with straw, then displayed like grotesque mannequins. Imagine walking into a city square and seeing what looked like a scarecrow, only to realize it was once a human being. The skin became both punishment and performance, a puppet show starring the very people who had dared to cross the empire. The truth is, no matter where you look, Europe, Asia, the Middle East, the Americas, the story repeats. Power-hungry rulers and angry mobs alike decided that skinning someone alive wasn't just a punishment, it was a message carved directly into flesh. And each story grows darker than the last. Because while it's one thing to strip away dignity, what happens when flaying becomes entertainment? When people don't just watch in fear, but cheer? That's where the line between punishment and performance starts to vanish, and history shows us exactly how far that can go. That line between punishment and performance blurred most clearly in the Roman world, where the empire had already mastered the art of spectacle. Gladiator games, executions, and public tortures weren't just punishments, they were shows. While flaying wasn't the centerpiece like crucifixion or feeding prisoners to lions, it still crept into accounts of how Rome dealt with enemies and rebels. The Romans had a knack for adopting the cruelties of those they conquered, and in regions influenced by Assyria or Persia, the tradition of flaying found its way into their toolkit. Some provincial governors were said to have ordered it, not because it was efficient, but because it sent a message as loud as 1,000 trumpets, and the audience didn't turn away. They leaned in. The idea that a body could become both punishment and performance fascinated them. Roman citizens expected their empire to put on a good show, and flaying provided something that was rare even in their blood-soaked arenas: the slow-motion unraveling of a human being. It was the kind of thing that stuck in the minds of onlookers, a warning tattooed onto their memory without ink. Centuries later, that sense of spectacle never faded. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, towns sometimes recorded flayings as civic events. One 15th century Flemish account describes rebels being skinned and their hides draped over chairs or stretched over drums. Picture a marching band where the instruments weren't just wood and hide, they were literally political warnings you could dance to. Music and murder stitched together in the most grotesque duet history could imagine. The detail that makes this all the more disturbing is how practical people thought it was. Human skin, once removed, didn't always go straight to display. There are whispers of it being turned into parchment, leather for bookbinding, or even clothing. That's right, justice wasn't just public, it could also be bound into your library or stitched into your wardrobe. There are reports, half fact, half legend, of officials keeping written records on sheets of human skin, as if the law itself demanded to be carried by the flesh of those who broke it. Nothing says follow the rules like reading them off a page that once screamed. But beyond Europe, the Aztecs brought an entirely different dimension to the practice. For them, flaying wasn't just about punishment, it was sacred. The festival of Tlacaxapahualistli, dedicated to the god Totec, centered around the ritual of flaying captives. Priests wore the skins of the sacrificed, walking around in them until the flesh rotted away. To the Aztecs, this wasn't grotesque, it was rebirth, renewal, the cycle of life dressed in another's shell. Farmers believed this symbolized seeds shedding their husks to sprout anew. But to outsiders, it looked like a nightmare parade. Holy men draped in fresh skins, living testaments to gods who demanded offerings that no field could ever yield. And while the Aztecs wrapped their practice in symbolism, the brutality was no less real. Victims knew that when the knife began its work, their bodies weren't just ending, they were about to become costumes. The community would see their faces in the flayed masks worn by priests, their skin literally animated by another person. Death wasn't just personal, it was public, woven into ritual and myth in a way that ensured the fear lingered long after the body was gone. But the reach of flaying didn't stop at rituals or punishments. It slipped into folklore and legend across continents. In Norse mythology, there's the tale of Loki being captured after causing the death of Balder. One version describes the god sewing his lips shut, but others whispered darker possibilities, punishments involving skinning parts of his body to silence his lies. Even when it wasn't officially recorded, the concept of flaying hovered at the edge of cultural imagination, a punishment so extreme it fit neatly into myths about gods and monsters. This blending of myth, ritual, and punishment gave flaying a unique position in human history. It wasn't just cruelty, it became a metaphor. Losing your skin meant losing your identity, your honor, your place in the world. The body without its covering was not just dead, it was unfinished, raw, exposed in a way that terrified even the hardest of warriors. And yet in some corners, the practice wasn't just tolerated, it was enjoyed. The Ottoman displays of straw-stuffed skins, the European drums stretched with flayed hides, the Aztec priests parading in their ghastly garments, all point to the same chilling truth. People didn't just watch flaying, they applauded it, reused it, and even turned it into artifacts that lived beyond the victim, which raises the darkest question of all. If flaying could move so seamlessly from execution to entertainment, what happened when rulers began to refine it, pushing the boundaries of endurance, experimenting not with death, but with how long a person could be kept alive without their skin? History doesn't just whisper answers, it shouts them from the blood-soaked stages of empires that treated human suffering like an art form. Executioners in certain parts of the world were less like butchers and more like surgeons, only their patients weren't meant to survive. They studied veins, tendons, and layers of flesh with the kind of precision that made flaying less of a hack job and more of a grim performance. Instead of killing quickly, they sought to test the limits of the body. How much skin could be peeled before the victim passed out? How long could the brain stay aware once every nerve was on fire? These were the questions whispered in dungeons and shouted in city squares, where spectators leaned in, equal parts horrified and thrilled. There are chilling reports from the Mughal Empire of soldiers and rebels being flayed in sections, starting at the arms or chest, so that the victim would remain conscious long enough to hear the crowd's reaction. The audience became participants, cheering or jeering, as if cruelty itself were a sport. Even more unsettling were cases where the flayed skin was preserved, dried and sometimes stuffed, leaving behind a trophy that lingered long after the victim's screams faded. It wasn't just death, it was a transformation into an object, a message that could hang from a wall or rest on a throne. And then there are the rumors that blur the line between history and legend. Some say certain rulers commissioned books bound in the skin of traitors, records of betrayal that could be read and touched for centuries. Whether all of these stories are true hardly matters. The fact that people told them shows just how deeply flaying seared itself into the human imagination. Even the threat of being skinned alive was enough to silence dissent. If you knew your legacy might end as a lampshade or a drum cover, rebellion didn't sound so tempting. The fascination with skin didn't stop with punishment. In Europe, whispers of anthropodermic bibliopegy, books bound in human leather, circulated among collectors and scholars. Some confirmed examples exist, though not always from executions. Still, the association with justice and cruelty was strong enough that every rumor reinforced the idea human skin could outlive its owner, carrying stories, laws, or warnings into the future. It was like history itself was being tattooed onto flesh, forever connecting the written word with the silent screams of the condemned. Meanwhile, in China, certain emperors were rumored to prefer the slow flay, peeling prisoners inch by inch, dragging the process across hours, sometimes days. It wasn't just about the victim's suffering. It was about control. A ruler who could unmake a person one layer at a time showed that power didn't just end life, it dismantled it. And when the remains were displayed, whether nailed to walls or paraded through streets, it told every citizen exactly where they stood, one mistake away from losing not just freedom, but their very skin. In the Ottoman world, soldiers who betrayed their posts or failed in their duties could find themselves turned into macabre warnings. Skins were sometimes displayed at military camps, as if to remind every soldier of the price of cowardice. The sight of a straw-filled husk that once stood beside you on the battlefield was enough to stitch loyalty into even the most restless recruit. Fear became armor, and the empire wore it proudly. And yet, despite its brutality, flaying kept slipping into the realm of ritual and symbol. The Aztecs weren't alone in using it to represent transformation. Some cultures believed the act stripped away not just flesh, but sin or dishonor. To them, the victim's suffering was more than punishment. It was purification, however twisted that logic may seem. Watching a body unravel was in their eyes watching justice itself become visible. Of course, not everyone accepted this without question. There are accounts of travelers, philosophers, and even some rulers who recoiled at the practice, calling it barbaric, monstrous, or unworthy of humanity. But their protests were often drowned out by the roar of the crowd or the silence of fear. For every person who dared to say enough, there were dozens who watched, cheered, or turned away, allowing the tradition to march on from one empire to the next. The most unsettling part is how normalized it became. People knew it was possible. They lived with the knowledge that their leaders, their neighbors, or their enemies might choose to strip them down to nothing but muscle and bone. That awareness shaped behavior, reinforced obedience, and carved invisible scars into entire societies. And just when it seemed flaying might fade into the shadows of history, echoes of it surfaced again, whispers of it being used in isolated cases, even into the modern era, in wars, uprisings, and acts of terrorism. The method refused to die, clinging to humanity's darkest corners, reminding us that cruelty isn't bound by time, because the question that lingers isn't just how people endured such punishment, but why humanity kept bringing it back. What was it about peeling away the very thing that defines us, our skin, that rulers and mobs found so irresistible? The answer hides somewhere between fear and fascination, and it leaves behind a chilling thought. If history repeated this horror so often, what's to stop it from being repeated again?